Hi friends, Mr. Spitzer here, and today we are working on Fantasy Lesson 3. Now, before we get started, I do want to explain that each of these lessons is focused on a specific writing element within fantasy writing. So one day we worked on brainstorming ideas for fantasy writing. The next day we talked about how to develop and write about characters that seem realistic in our fantasy writing stories. But our end goal for this writing unit, you will be using all of your writing workshop notebook and all of your graphic organizers to completely write your own fantasy story. So our end goal is the creation of our own fantasy story. With that being said, this is Fantasy Writing Lesson 3. And Lesson 3's focus is on writing about the setting, or where our story is going to take place. So I am in my Google Classroom. I'm going to read the instructions for the assignment, and it says, today we will be working on writing about setting in our fantasy story. We will think about places from the real world and ask, what if, to slightly change the setting. Step 1 says, please watch the lesson video, which if you're here, you're already doing step 1. Step 2 says to open up Google Documents and select your digital fantasy writing workshop notebook. Step 3 says to click on the lesson 3 in the table of contents or scroll to lesson 3. Step 4 says to fill in the heading with your name, date, and class number. And then step 5 says to complete the graphic organizer and notebook entry, which I will explain how to do right now. So I am on Google and I'm signed into my fake student, so I see exactly what you see. I am going to go to Google Docs, just like step 2 said. And when I'm in Google Documents, I am looking for my writing workshop notebook. One good tip or good thing that you can do is you can star this notebook. At the very top, you can see the star here. If you star it, it's going to come up to your top as like your favorited or important documents. So it's really a good idea to star the documents that are important to you or that you'll be using consistently. So I am here in my writing workshop notebook and I am scrolling down to my table of contents for lesson 3. It's the what if setting lesson. So I click on lesson 3 and I click on the bookmark and it brings me right to lesson 3. You can see here that I already have my name typed in and the date. You should do that for every single lesson that you complete. And the first part is the do now section. So this is to get our brain thinking about the teaching point for the day and about fantasy writing in general. So our do now question says, why is setting especially important in fantasy stories? So I want everyone to take a minute and you're going to type in your answer in a complete sentence for why setting or why, like where the story takes place is important, and especially in fantasy stories. So give it some thought, complete sentences, fill it right where the emoji says to do it, and we are going to move on. So our teaching point says, fantasy stories have very powerful settings that can be both magical and non-magical. In order to create these magical places, writers of fantasy can begin to describe a setting that was in our world, but different somehow. Writers ask themselves, what if, to craft their magical setting for their stories. So for our graphic organizer today, I always like to give examples of things that I've previously done. So for today's lesson, I do want to show a model example of how you're going to create possible fantasy settings by using the phrase what if. So it says here, for an example, click here. You're going to be able to click on that and open it up, and I've already done that here. And here we have an example of lesson 3 being filled out. So the first part of our graphic organizer, you're going to pick a real world setting or a real place that you're familiar with. So for my example, I picked my apartment complex. So it's a small town in New Jersey, it's modern day, it's springtime. That's a real world setting that I'm familiar with because I'm spending all my days here right now. The next part of this graphic organizer, you're going to use that real world setting and you're going to put a slight twist to it. So a what if. So by my apartment complex, there are a lot of, unfortunately, landfills. So my what if was, what if all of the landfills and the litter that sits outside of cities secretly house monsters or evil creatures? And hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. So that would make a crazy fantasy setting. It's a real world place. There are landfills out here, but they don't have secretly housed monsters or creatures, not that I know of. So this, you can see how I slightly changed it to create this magical or fantasy setting. So on this right-hand side here, where it says the fantasy setting, I'm going to describe how that place would look then. So it says magical creatures, including goblins, ghouls, and imps, have started appearing all around New Jersey and New York City. As scientists around the world search for a reason why, it becomes clear landfills and trash piles are places where these animals are coming from. So that is one example. The next example says, what if acts of kindness added time into your life expectancy, but negative actions took years away from your life? And what made me think of this is outside my apartment complex, and that's my real world setting, a lot of drivers like to lay on their horns and beep and yell out the window. And it made me think about why people are so negative sometimes and how people should be more positive. So I put this slight twist on things, and I said that if people were nice, you got more years added onto your life, and if you were mean, you got years taken away. And that helped me to think about a possible different fantasy setting. And it says, in this fantasy world, acts of kindness get rewarded with a boost in how long you can live. Some of the nicest people are living to be hundreds of years old. But what negative actions are harming people? Did beeping at the bad driver just cost a person valuable time? There's much to learn about this world. So in my description of this fantasy setting, it almost sounds like the back of the book. I want people to be excited about where this story is taking place. And for my last example, the what if is, what if people could talk to animals? And in thinking about that what if, I have to see how that would change my fantasy setting. So I said that animals' attacks have been reduced and there are no longer zoos. This is due to a startling change after a worldwide storm. There is now only one common language where animals and people can all communicate. What other things have changed in this world? Again, I'm taking a what if, and I noticed a bunch of birds flying around. I have a dog at home. So I took my real world setting and I made a slight change to it to create this fantasy setting. So after looking at this example, what you are going to do is you are going to type in your own real world setting, a place that you're familiar with. You are going to slightly change or make a twist to that setting and then explain how your new fantasy setting would look. When you're done, you're going to come down here to directions. Don't forget to do this last part after your graphic organizer. And it says that now that you've done some brainstorming, describe which setting where your story will take place you want to focus on in your entry below. So you're going to pick one of these settings based on your real world place, and you are going to describe it down here. I want complete sentences and try to use some sensory details and make it a good paragraph. I'm excited to read some of your fantasy settings. You've done a great job at creating your fantasy characters and brainstorming ideas. And if you have any questions, make sure to join my office hours from 10 to 11 o'clock every day. Hope to talk to everyone soon.